Implementing ITIL, Module number 6. Lessons learned for each ITIL process. In this learning module, we will finish our IT Service Management Design work stage by presenting some real working issues that people have run into when implementing ITIL. We will walk through all of the ITIL V3 processes, life cycle stage by life cycle stage, and discuss typical problems, issues, and resistance that you might encounter as you start to implement. It is hoped that by reviewing these here, you can quickly reduce the likelihood that problems and issues will impact your efforts by allowing you to prepare for them in advance. So here is where we are at so far. In learning module number 1, we ran through the entire ITIL implementation life cycle at a very high level. Learning module number 2, we covered the vision work stage, the importance of setting a business vision, setting objectives, establishing an ITIL program charter, that this is really an organizational change effort, really more than an IT effort, working with your stakeholders and getting people on board with the effort. In learning module number 3, we covered ITIL assessments, learning how to assess our processes, technologies, organization, and governance and reporting practices. In learning module number 4, we learned how to translate the output of those assessments into recommendations and action items, and finally into initial win efforts that we can execute to show real results with our implementation effort. We covered some of the basics for the ITSM planning phase, as well as the ITSM initial wins phase as well. In learning module number 5, we then got into the basics for IT service management design and covered a 10-stage approach that you can use to implement an ITIL process. Here in learning module number 6, we are now going to step back a bit for our implementation approach and review typical issues that you might encounter ITIL V3 process by ITIL V3 process. Here is what we plan to cover in this learning module. Each lesson will correspond to an ITIL version 3 service life cycle stage: service operation, service transition, service design, service strategy, and continual service improvement. We will go process by process within each life cycle stage and discuss some of the key experiences that others have seen when implementing those ITIL processes. Lesson 1, Service Operation Processes. In this lifecycle stage, we'll start by looking at the V3 Service Operation Lifecycle processes: request fulfillment, incident management, problem management, event management, and access management processes. Let's start by looking at some of our experiences around request fulfillment. The very first barrier or challenge you will run into with request fulfillment is understanding the difference between what is a service and what is a request. There is a common mistake that people treat requests as services, which in reality they are not. Think of requests as transactions against services. Therefore, when you design an IT service, you must also think of how people will use it and what requests they will make that need to be fulfilled. Let's take an example of this. Suppose you are offering an email service. By delivering an email capability, that is a service that you are providing. That service will involve a number of requests that will need to be fulfilled. In order to identify these requests, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the user, or those that will be using the service, and understand in advance the kinds of things that they will ask for from this service. So in our email example, some examples of requests that we might see might be things like establish a new email account, or remove an email account, or make my mailbox bigger, or change the ID on my mailbox. Those are examples of requests that would align themselves with the email service that need to be fulfilled. As you design a service, You need to understand all the requests that could potentially be associated with it, and then develop a fulfillment process or procedure for each one of those. You may also have significant issues here in that many IT organizations struggle with how to identify, describe, and package their services in a manner that makes sense to the business. IT will, in many cases, think they understand the services they are delivering, when many times all they really understand is their day-to-day activities in terms of their jobs and responsibilities. That is not the same as how the business may see the kinds of IT services they're getting. So there are many challenges with doing this, and complicating this factor are current products in the marketplace around service catalogs that tend to mix up the idea of request and service to the point where services, or actually requests, are now being called services. And you may hear some odd terms that are not ITIL-like, such as actionable services and things like that. But what those tools are really doing is they are providing workflow for fulfilling requests in many cases. Not that that's not important, but there's confusion now because many vendors are marketing those as catalog tools, which in essence they are not really fulfilling that kind of a function. So here we go with some of the points around request fulfillment. IT will get confused over the difference between managing a request lifecycle versus designing and building the procedures needed to fulfill the requests. If you are working with this, you will need to be very careful with the scope and the intentions of your stakeholders. Building the request fulfillment process is really about the generic process for how you receive, handle, parse, and process requests and see them to their conclusion one way or another. That is different than an action item that says we might actually build a fulfillment procedure, let's say to install a server, or to establish a new user, for example, or to bring an employee on board. Your stakeholders may be looking for those very specific solutions and may lose sight that there's really a request fulfillment process behind that. So be very careful when scoping this that you fully understand where they see the value and what the outcomes may be. You may want to develop a release template for each type of request that is to be fulfilled. This describes the steps needed to fulfill the request. So for every request that you build, you will need a release template that describes the procedure, is handled just like a release in terms of how you build it in order to fulfill that request. Another area of confusion is IT may confuse a request with a change request. A way to think of this is that your end users and customers outside of IT only communicate with IT in two ways. They either issue a request because they need something, or they call the service desk or raise an incident because something's not working. That is the only two ways that those parties communicate with IT. Internally, IT may issue change requests in order to fulfill a request that was submitted by an end customer, or to help resolve an incident or some other issue that's internal to IT. The key point here is that end users never issue changes. They never fill out RFCs. That is something that IT does internally. The end users will only issue requests. You also may want to add common requests to your service catalog, and this just makes it simple and easy for those people using the catalog to understand the kinds of things that they can ask for as they utilize their different services. And then the last point we already addressed, which is mentioning and being careful that many service catalog tools are really adding value by automating their request fulfillment activities. And again, that's certainly a valuable tool to have, and it's certainly helpful. However, don't confuse that with what the purpose and goal is of having a service catalog. Let's take a look at the incident management process. The incident management process is about trying to resolve incidents that occur in the infrastructure in an efficient and hopefully a quick manner that's in line with the service levels and targets that are in place. It's also about improving the communication around incidents so that everybody's aware of the incidents that are taking place, what status they're in, or what may be happening with them if they're not fully resolved. With incident management, the key will be implementing communications across many departments and business entities. Who gets notified? When do they get notified? How will they be notified? Roles and responsibilities may come next. Who takes the action? When do they escalate? There is a great tendency with this process for IT people to focus on the tool sets. While these are necessary, and certainly having an incident management tool is very key to underpin this process, the effort to instill the proper communications and responsibilities is still absolutely key, and the effort to establish these should not be underestimated. If we look at some of the points here on this slide, number one, IT is very comfortable with this process. They're very used to handling incidents historically, and they fully understand, in a lot of cases, a lot of the terms and can easily see the approach of how this process is operating. Again, incident escalation and communication is key, and again, this effort's way underestimated many times. Careful attention should be paid to an incident classification schema. In other words, how do you classify and categorize your incidents? Because that's very critical towards aiding the other ITIL processes. One of the key outcomes of the incident management process is to provide data on incidents that can be used by other processes such as availability management or problem management, and even your service reporting. Unless some aspects of service level management, either with knowing your services through service catalog and having key service targets in place, you may still get confusion around which incidents are more critical than others. Again, trying to do incident management without understanding your services or understanding your main service targets means that you're operating a little bit blindly in terms of how you categorize your incidents and what the targets truly are for when those incidents should be resolved. A lot of people will make the mistake of assuming that the goal of incident management is to resolve incidents as fast as possible. It's really to solve incidents within identified service targets. Not every incident necessarily deserves the attention that everybody needs to run and drop what they're doing in order to fix it as quickly as possible. Establishing roles and responsibilities for incident handling that include overall ownership for incident resolution across multiple disciplines is typically a common barrier that IT has trouble establishing. In working with the incident management process and in the throes of resolving an incident, whoever the incident owner is needs to work across the server group, the network group, the operations group, possibly applications development, and they need to be able to coordinate those groups in order to get that incident resolved. There is no passing the buck, if you will, from group to group in the ITIL incident management process. And lastly, you may want to consider training IT to communicate in business terms versus techno-speak, as that is also another common issue that many people have when operating and communicating incidents. Think about the non-IT person that has to read through an incident ticket or understand, especially for major incidents, why an incident took place, what actions were taken. Will they truly understand what is going on if you use a lot of internal IT technical terms? Now let's take a look at problem management. Again, problem management is really trying to reduce the number of incidents by getting to their root cause and taking actions to remove the errors from the infrastructure. Problem management is really the key towards reducing both incidents and the time it takes to resolve them. This is a very powerful process that really gets a lot of short shrift when you think about it. A common mistake in IT is to assume that since they're getting lots of incidents or have availability issues, that they should therefore focus on the incident management process. And while that may be partially true, the real goals to fixing those kinds of problems will occur actually through problem management and or availability management. The reason for that is that in incident management, the incident has already happened. It's problem and availability that work proactively to try to prevent those incidents from occurring in the first place, and that is where the end business will actually see the best benefits. So a common mistake is that most organizations will try to assign this responsibility for problems really to only one or two few individuals that typically have little authority to coordinate outside their current positions. Again, you need to set this up so that the problem manager and the people that work in that area can be successful with what they're doing. The interfaces and handoffs for when incidents should be escalated to problem management, a lot of times there's confusion, and this needs to be very well defined, typically by developing a problem management policy. Again, incidents could be both incidents as well as problems. A basic way to look at this sometimes is to assume that if the root cause is not known, then it's probably should be escalated to problem all the time. So it's okay to have something that's both an incident and a problem. It's just that the focus is a little different. Another common mistake is that most organizations only use this process as a higher support function that steps in and resolves major incidents when they occur with little proactive activity. So in other words, we have a major incident that just happened, and now we bring the problem team to bear to help with that. In reality, that problem management team really needs to be proactively looking at incidents to look for trends and understand that if there's maybe proactive actions they can take to eliminate groups of incidents from occurring in the first place. A poor incident classification scheme, which we talked about on the earlier slide, will hinder the success of problem management activities. So if your incidents are not classified in a way that makes logical sense, where different things can be grouped appropriately, then the problem manager has a very much of a challenge in wending through those incidents to try to find commonalities and look for actions that may be taken to eliminate groups of incidents. Tremendous value can be achieved by having the problem management own the development of the problem-solving skills in your organization with training templates and toolkits that can be employed when problems occur. Here I'm adding something which is not really mentioned in the EIDL books, but it is very key to helping gain acceptance for this. You have the opportunity within problem management to create some common techniques and skills and capabilities, and through lunch and learns and workshops, train all the other IT people in these techniques so that when incidents and problems do occur, you have a much smarter team all around that can help solve and fix these problems a lot faster. Lastly, you may want to consider a problem life cycle that needs to be employed to provide a repeatable process for how you handle problems and communicate their status to IT executives. This becomes really critical for very acute problems or major incidents that occur. By life cycle, meaning that every problem goes through a standard stage. It might be looking at symptoms, then it might be developing hypotheses as to what the possible root cause might be. Then it might be a research stage to examine each area to see if it truly is the root cause. Then we find the root cause, and we possibly provide a bypass or workaround, and then we finally take actions to remove the problem from the infrastructure. And you could set that up as a life cycle, and you can report on the progress of problems by that life cycle. And by doing this, you can actually see how well IT is proactively working to fix problems, and it also cuts a lot of the questions that come down from senior management in terms of where are we at on this particular issue or problem. Very good technique, which I would recommend if you're working with this process. Now let's turn to event management. Event management is about capturing events in the IT infrastructure and forwarding them to the appropriate parties to take action. Many IT organizations underestimate the effort it takes to identify the events, design them, escalate them, automate them, correlate them, and filter them, to, in other words, get the noise out in terms of extraneous messages and things that people don't really care about, and also to maintain those over time. That is a big effort to put into place, especially if you haven't started with that. Don't fall into the trap of trying to design this process around the tools that are available. You want to start with what are the events that you need to generate, which is a different question than starting with what events do our tools give us. It is important that you identify what events you need to have to appropriately manage your infrastructure and to jump on issues as early as possible. If you just simply look at your tool sets, or even maybe look at tool sets you plan to buy, and you're making those decisions solely based on what the tool might provide in terms of what it monitors or can raise as events, then it's possible you may miss things in the infrastructure that need to be addressed. The effort of identifying which events get escalated to the right people in the right organizations is a large effort not to be underestimated. That is also a mapping exercise that you will need to maintain over time as part of your event management process. The EIDL advice of generating only events of significance for management and IT staff should always be considered to avoid generating lots of noise. Don't implement lots of monitoring tools that generate a lot of operational event and information along that line and put things in the log files and reports that all of a sudden create so much noise that people can't see what the real issues are. Use that very judiciously in terms of what events you decide to generate, what events you decide to keep and store for information, and what events need to be reacted to so that it's very clear that these are events that will require some further action. A constant stream of events that have little significance basically starts to contribute to a culture of ignoring those events, so be aware of that. I have been at some companies where there was an attempt to bypass event design, some of these items we talked about here earlier, and as a result they implemented the tool out of the box. This generated lots of events to the technical staff and created so many of them that the technical staff began shutting their pagers off and not really looking at consoles or information because they knew that half of the events generated didn't need to be taken care of to begin with. So people could fall into this ignore type of culture, and be careful of that. The creation of event consoles, console management, and establishment of a command center or operations bridge is a large effort in itself. If you don't have that infrastructure in place today and it's determined that you're going to be setting up a command center complete with operational consoles, view monitors, display devices, that is a project in itself to put into place. So don't sell yourself short on that effort if that's a piece of event management that you need to include as you put this solution in place. One last item about event management is that a key outcome from this process is to think of this as also a front line for collecting your IT events and historical event information that many other ITIL processes might use to support their activities. And again, availability management, problem management, security management, access management might all be looking at these as part of the daily activities that they do within each of those processes. Let's now look at access management. Access management is about allowing access to needed services at the right time and to the right people. I kind of look at it as the operational side of security. It's another way to kind of view that. So within access management, we'll be coordinating services on behalf of end users to help them manage their own IDs and passwords, and it contributes greatly to user satisfaction with IT services. There's an aspect of allowing business units to control who they think is authorized to use various services, and if you can leverage them in helping to manage that, that's certainly helpful and increases some of their satisfaction. You can save a lot of labor by tying sets of IDs and access control lists to user job profiles and roles. Although creating these links, again, just like other areas in ITIL where mapping is involved, it's going to be an ongoing maintenance task. Mundane tasks such as resetting passwords should be handled through automation wherever possible and tied in tightly with request fulfillment. So changing a password, again, is another form of request, hopefully one that gets solved fairly quickly, but it's still a request. But try to automate this wherever you can. I still see many companies, even today, that are still doing password resets manually, and every time they admit that that's almost half or more of the service desk calls that they end up getting. So you might want to consider automating this as a first step if you're just getting started with access management. Most IT people will typically forget that control of visitor logs, badge access, and other means are also need to be considered as part of this process. Access to the data center is still a form of access. So physical access controls should also fall under this in terms of the process scope that you're working with. Single sign-on solutions should be used where reasonably possible, although be careful because this is still an area where not everything quite works under single sign-on. So I've not yet seen an organization that's truly achieved this as a goal. However, there are certainly fairly large swaths of access that you can do with single sign-on that can certainly make life a lot easier for end users so they don't keep getting Gina's asking for logons and passwords for every little thing that they do in IT. Non-traditional access approaches, if you decide to employ them, an example of this might be biometrics or other means. Again, be aware of these. They typically have a 70 to 80% success rate, meaning that if there's a failure in the attempt to use this, you're going to need to consider that as a risk and mitigate it in your design for access management. As an example, with biometrics, that's where you're using, let's say, like a fingerprint to access services. It's already been shown in a number of studies that certain cultures, ethnic cultures, don't serve well through the biometric device and tend to have higher amounts of failures than others. That's just one example where you have to consider things like that and make sure that you have a mitigation in place as you start to do that. So again, be careful with the non-traditional access approaches and make sure that you've considered all the risks and issues in putting that into place as well. Lesson 2, Service Transition Processes. In this lifecycle stage, we'll start by looking at the V3 Service Transition Lifecycle processes: change management, release and deployment management, service asset and configuration management, knowledge management, service testing, transition planning, and the evaluation process. Let's take a look at the change management process. Change management is about coordinating and processing all the changes that are in the IT infrastructure in a coordinated manner to protect services as changes are being made. This distinction that change management coordinates approvals for every change and release management implements changes under those approvals is an area of confusion that needs to be addressed right off the bat. Understanding the difference between change and release tends to be a challenge within the IT organization, and unfortunately even the ITIL v3 books still did not quite fully solve that confusion problem. A simple way to think about how change differs from release is think of change as being the coordinating process. Think of release as the implementing process. So change management is about coordinating a change within the IT environment, reviewing the change, scheduling the change, getting the approval for the change, making sure the right parties are working on the change, following through to make sure the change was implemented, and all those things that are in the ITIL change management process. Again, those are coordinating types of activities. Think of release management as actually the implementation side of the change. Release management is going to plan the implementation, it's going to do the design work, the procurement, the implementation work, the testing work, packaging changes into releases, and then creating release packages that are ready to go into a production state. So I always think of release management as an implementation support process. I think of change management as the coordination side of that. I find that works very well within most IT organizations. If you start trying to point to different changes or types of changes and say this is a change or this type of change is really a release, that just creates utter confusion in the IT organization as well as among the people that are using the process. So I would recommend thinking coordinate and implement, which means that basically everything that gets done in IT is probably a change in some form or fashion. And every implementation task is probably a form of release management in some form or fashion. Acknowledge that change management is really an overhead that inhibits the progress of IT for good reasons, but make every effort to make this as efficient as possible through early implementation and recognition of standard changes when it makes sense. So what we're really saying here is from the get-go, when you start this process, acknowledge that change management is an overhead that will get in the way of people trying to get things done within their other activities. That's just a plain fact. And I would acknowledge that with people up at the front so that everyone recognizes that and will force the thinking to make sure that the change management effort is implemented in the most efficient manner as possible, balancing out risk from what needs to get done. Report and highlight change activities, especially undetected changes, when recognized, to embed practices into the organization. So again, put metrics out there with this process as quickly as you can and publish those so that people can see right from the first day how well that change approach is starting to work and where some of the flaws or things that aren't working might be showing up. A common mistake also made is to only provide IT workers with how a new change practice is going to take place without stating why. So if you're training people on your new change process, make sure you constantly give them the rationale why we are doing things this way, which might be different from the way we used to do that. If you just simply present what the new process is without stating why, You may encounter some resistance as people, again, will view this as it's getting in the way of me trying to get my work done. And again, that's something you're trying to get over. A common mistake, don't over-architect the process. That's another common mistake. Significant benefits can be attained simply by ensuring that all changes are logged and recognized, even though you may not have implemented other parts of the process. But you've implemented a very important communication tool, and a lot of times, even though the full process is not in place, people will start to act and behave in ways that might still somewhat work, even with just that small amount of communication. So again, architect the things into this process that you need, but don't try to make this such an all-encompassing effort that all of a sudden you've created this large administrative nightmare that gets in the way of people trying to get things done. As you put your CAB together, Change Advisory Board, realize that the effort to do that will be much more than you originally anticipated. I find sometimes in companies this starts to turn a bit political because the IT organization is trying to figure out, well, who's the right person that should sit on the CAB, what happens if that person can't make all the meetings, and those kinds of issues tend to get there. So make sure that you plan ahead that the political side of pulling your CAB together may be an issue. One approach I use, by the way, to deal with things like that are simply to just ask for an interim CAB member or a temporary CAB member until that particular department finds the right person that they want to put in there. Sometimes that helps you get your CAB going much earlier, and then you can replace that person at the appropriate time. So remember, with change management, one important aspect here, which sometimes doesn't get considered, is that of establishing standard changes at the front while you're building the process to minimize overhead and red tape. That will build your acceptance much faster. Think about what happens when you roll this process out. The very first thing somebody's going to say is, oh gee, you mean I have to do a password reset? That means I have to fill out an RFC form and go through all these approvals, and they're going to start to resist from day one. If you've already built standard changes into your solution as you're developing this, then right away people will see the difference between how a standard change allows them to very quickly get things done and what things actually truly need more time and attention for analysis and impact. So by seeing that at the front, they will be much faster to get on board with you in terms of adopting this in terms of the process. Another area is make sure you find a way to recognize and deal with unreported changes. These create literally the greatest risk within the infrastructure and undermine the process very quickly. So having a way to detect these, even if it's just through random audits, or raising these when incidents occur and you discover there's a change that was made that caused the incident that never was approved, those are things you want to grab onto and track immediately and include those in your reporting so that everybody in the infrastructure that's managing the infrastructure sees who's making those kinds of changes and where they're occurring. You'd be surprised how just simple publicity over that kind of a thing will quickly reduce the occurrences of those kinds of things. Now let's turn to release and deployment management. Again, release is about implementing changes as well as packaging changes in manner that it makes logical sense for release to production. Again, the biggest challenge you'll have there will be the one we mentioned in the last slide, which is what's a release versus what's a change. And remember, change is coordinating implementations. Release is actually doing the implementation work. The release policy will probably take up most of the time as you design this particular process. That's going to provide the key governance over how all the release activities are executed, how releases will typically be packaged together, release naming conventions, rules, responsibilities, that will all go into your release policy. And so there will be a lot of people that will want to look at this early on. So don't underestimate the effort for pulling that policy together. Another area is because release management is very broad in terms of its scope and what's involved with that. Make sure you have very explicit goals and that you very well scoped out what you're trying to get done as you implement this first wave of release management process activities. For example, should processes reach into how applications are being developed? Is that how far you want to go with this process? Or only at the point that they're moved to production? So again, scope this very carefully as you go forward with this because there's a lot of groups that are involved with releasing and implementing solutions, and you want to only implement and impact those things that you're really trying to fix at this point in time. Don't take the concept of a definitive media library overboard. It's okay if that's federated. In fact, I think now version 3 assumes it is at this point. But the key thing here is that as you identify and find authorized sources of software or other media in your infrastructure, make sure you lock them down somewhere, and again, put those under the control of change management as quickly as possible. Roles and responsibilities for release management activities need to be well defined in this process, and again, without these, things can slip into confusion very easily. You may want to consider implementing an operational readiness process into your release management lifecycle. This is especially good for major releases or major application solutions that can provide benefits right away. So in other words, you have a true process or production certification gate. I've seen some companies call it that. But having a certification process of some kind that says this release is now certified for production use, and that implies that you've gone through all the release steps of approvals and testing and all those things that it takes to make sure it's operationally ready. Strive to change the paradigm of developing releases and then turning them over to production without operational readiness being built into the solution. One of the great concepts in ITIL version 3 is, if you remember back to your foundation days of service warranty and utility, is making sure that those warranty aspects, availability, capacity, operability, all those things are built into the solution from day one and turned over to operations. If you're simply throwing those solutions over to operations without those items, and now you're depending on the operations teams to build that, that's where a lot of incidents and turnover issues start to occur. So using the release management process to help change that discipline will be very key to helping some of the success as you go forward with this. Service asset and configuration management. Configuration management is really one of the harder processes to deal with. It underpins many things, and to be honest, the vendors have not really yet caught up to the technologies that are truly needed to make this process work. The purpose of having configuration management is to understand in a blueprint fashion how all your service assets are, or the pieces and parts of your infrastructure, are put together and tied together to underpin the services that IT delivers. It's through configuration management that the relationships between these assets is understood and known, and allows other processes within ITIL to basically quickly follow through with some of the activities that they need to do, be it impact analysis, understanding root causes, those kinds of areas. Configuration management can certainly provide a lot of benefits there. If your focus, as you get started on this, is on implementing a CMDB, or Configuration Management Database, I will tell you at the front, you are already in trouble. Getting the tool should not be the first step that you use in doing this. Your first step is really to understand, first of all, what services do you deliver, what assets are associated with those services, and then define your data needs, developing a data model and ideally service models that allow you to understand those relationships between those service assets and the services they support. You also may have many CI types that cannot be automatically auto-discovered or have their relationships auto-handled. Examples of some of these might include things such as organization entities, physical locations, third-party support contracts, service level agreements, or how your service assets tie back to services. A lot of this is work you will need to do in the form of a data model and/or service model, and you need to do that work up front. Then go shopping for the appropriate tool that allows you to store that information, process and maintain it in an efficient manner. Another area here is that key considerations should be taken to not over-architect the solution, and make sure that you tie everything you do here to change management and develop this data schema to link your CIs and relationships together. By over-architecting the solution, an example of that is I've been in some companies where IT tries to literally put their entire IT infrastructure into a configuration management database. when in reality, maybe 75% of that information does not really need to be tracked or maintained. So again, be very careful with this process. It's one of the few processes where, if you're not careful, can suddenly become a very huge project very quickly, probably developing a lot more than you originally intended when you started. So again, in looking at some of the issues around this, vendor solutions are still somewhat immature. Be aware of that. Avoid building repositories that don't include the relationships between CIs. These don't provide a whole lot of value. In fact, I will go forward and say that if all you've done is simply stored all your service assets into a configuration management database, but not how they tie back to the services, essentially what you've done is you've just built a very fancy asset management database and nothing else. Again, we said don't over-architect the solution. Start from high levels and work your way down. Detail only those areas where the information provides value. Think of information in your CMDB as providing value. And for those things that provide lots of value, those are the things that you want to track. Logical data design skills are very key to developing this process. This may be a skill set that the typical IT operations group doesn't have. The development of a data schema, metadata, it's a critical part of your CMDB design, and a lot of times I find many IT organizations overlook this step when they're putting their solution together. Design your configuration management processes. Again, design these first, link them to change controls before you even begin to put that first CI into your configuration management database. Otherwise, it's going to fall out of date and very quickly. I have one example of a very, very large banking organization that literally spent millions of dollars on a configuration management solution, populated it literally with over 12 million CIs in that database with very weak configuration and change control. And within literally 1 to 2 months, that database was totally useless. And even all those in IT will say that it's just a step they do to square things with their management, but beyond that, they never use it for anything else. Don't fall into that kind of a trap. Unless you're a very small company with very few applications and IT services, a federated CMDB approach will most likely be what you end up with. If you look at ITIL v3, they already acknowledge the importance of federation of CMDBs, and that's just to address the reality that information may come from multiple sources, and you need to have a way to federate that together. That implies that you have built an architected or an architecture solution first for your CMDB or configuration process, again, before you go out buying tools for it. It is okay to link authorized sources of existing repositories as a starting point and then integrate these over time. At least people will know where to find the information. So you may already have repositories of things. Let's say there might be some network configuration maps sitting in maybe a network management tool. You may have a listing of PCs and serial numbers that's sitting in somebody's spreadsheet. Again, you can start by identifying these. If they're authorized sources, lock them down under change management, and then implement your configuration process on top of that. That may seem a little awkward to do. However, there's a lot of value with that, and now that people know where to find that information. Remember, as you build the solution, to include things like organization, who's responsible for various aspects, service catalogs, SLAs, OLAs, supplier contracts, policies, process documentation. All of these are part of your configuration management solution, and they're also types of CIs that you may want to be tracking. Don't just track hardware and software. I see that happen quite a lot in many different IT organizations. That really does not provide a lot of value in terms of what the whole configuration management process within ITIL was designed to do. Service testing. The Service V model in ITIL version 3 is a good example of a way to do levels of testing for changes in new services where the risks are medium to high. By doing this, this means you are conducting operational acceptance and release tests in those situations. The generation and maintenance of test data as you put this solution into place is going to be a service into itself that is always ongoing. So for each service that you're providing to your end users and customers, there's a suite of test data and test use cases that will go along with that that can quickly be brought up when needed to test changes or enhancements to those services when they get built. Tests that you do in the Service V model, especially at levels 1, 2, and 3, that's the service review, acceptance, and operational testing, if possible, those should be done by independent parties wherever possible. In other words, don't fall into the trap where those people that built the solution are also doing the testing and reporting on the results of that solution. Try to have an independent party do that testing at those levels if possible. Managing a test lab is another area that could become part of service testing. That implies a whole service in itself, and it quickly examples of types of things that can happen within that service might mean building test environments for people, operating the test environment on their behalf, recovering a test environment, and then disassembling a test environment and reassembling one in a very quick, consistent, repeatable manner. This helps people that are doing design and development of new services. It allows those things to be tested very quickly, and you can provide other services as part of a test lab service, including reporting on test results, helping to generate use cases, and those kinds of things. So again, think about test lab management if that should be within scope of your solution as you're building this. Testing personnel need to understand the testing process in terms of generating test criteria, running test cycles, handling test failures, and reporting on test results. So again, you'll need to populate people that have responsibilities around testing and make sure those are assigned to the appropriate parties. One of the things, especially as you do user acceptance testing or you're running a pilot, for example, let's say in a large rollout situation, is make sure you set the expectations when you bring users in to participate on those tests. Set their expectations very carefully. Otherwise, if that test doesn't work, they're going to quickly assume that whatever solution you're building is no good. And then worse than that, when they go back to their respective departments, they'll be telling other people that the solution is no good, even though maybe you expected to run into some of those failures during that early stage of testing. So be very careful setting expectations when you bring others in to do that testing with your solution, so that they fully understand that mistakes will happen and that doesn't mean that the solution you're building is going to be problematic when it finally goes live. Knowledge management. Architecting this solution in the design stage is going to be the real key to being successful with this. Develop your knowledge management architecture first before you go out selecting and implementing tools. More importantly, sift through the needs of the knowledge that you need to have. Again, think of knowledge as value. What knowledge information will provide the most benefit and the most value to your organization? How will people use your knowledge solution once it's in place? Try to understand those things first, then do the architecture, and then finally go out and do whatever selection and implementation of tools you need to support that. Also consider that you may need knowledge owners from day one that have accountability for making sure that knowledge is accurate and up to date. Another responsibility they have is making sure that items are eliminated from the knowledge management infrastructure that really aren't needed or viable anymore. So looking at some of these points here, it's very typical that IT will assign this process to staff that has unclear goals and responsibilities. That's just been my experience in many companies. Typically, they've heard that having a knowledge solution is important, and so they'll look for somebody that has nothing much else to do, and they'll assign them to the knowledge team. Okay, make sure there's very clear goals and outcomes and responsibilities for what you're really trying to build here. The ITIL v3 guidance in this area, by the way, is very good, and it can stand on its own in terms of how knowledge should be managed, stored, and maintained. So I would urge you to look at the ITIL v3 knowledge management chapter in the service transition book. You'll find a lot of nuggets in there in terms of how to really build this process and manage it pretty well. Again, as we stated, be careful not to over-design the service knowledge management system. There's nothing wrong with short-term solutions. Again, it's the value we're looking for, not the technologies that we want to provide. Special care should be taken in designing the types of knowledge to be maintained. And again, as we stated, this should be done before investing in any tool. Again, think of the types of knowledge in terms of value. What is the most important in terms of things that people need to know? Special care should be taken in classifying each knowledge asset in terms of who has the authority to view, modify, add, or delete it. Also, as you classify this, make sure whatever tooling solution or approach you use to get to the knowledge, that it's very clear and very easy and efficient for people to find things and know where they can get it. Transition planning. IT typically forgets to take a holistic view of this, and again, transition planning is the planning work that you do between getting a solution from its build stage, if you will, into finally a production state. So take a holistic view of everything that needs to be involved in transition planning. In other words, not just the technologies, but make sure you're looking at the people, the training, the knowledge assets that need to be in place, other items. It's not just the hardware and software, and that's the key message here. Think of how people will use this service, the solution that you're putting into place, and what are all the things that they will need to have to make that work. Again, if you go back to the pillars, which we've reiterated a number of times, process, technology, organization, and governance, that's a good guide as a checklist to make sure you've looked at the solution holistically and considered that in your transition planning. Business executives, chief financial officers, and sometimes even chief information officers typically underestimate the need for transition planning, strategy, or how this may impact their success and costs. There's a tendency in the IT industry to focus quite a bit on development of the solution, not so much on how that solution will be transitioned and operated on a day-to-day basis at acceptable cost and risk. So keep that in mind as you do your transition planning, that you allow the planning for this transition to occur in a way that's cost-effective, that minimizes risk, and makes a success of the solution that's being put into place. Conducting a service risk assessment is key to building a proper transition strategy. So as you're putting your strategy together for how you will transition this solution to production, you may want to do an upfront service risk assessment, look for all the likelihoods and possibilities of risks that can occur, and then include that as part of your transition strategy. What happens if that cutover on Friday night doesn't work? What will you do? What happens if the solution is in place on Monday morning and it flat out doesn't work? What if it's giving wrong data? Think of those kinds of risks in advance and put that into your transition plan so that there's fallback in the event that things don't go as planned. Lastly, communicate with the business about the transition strategy to be deployed, the approach you're using, and how its status is when implemented as things keep moving forward. Keep their expectations in line. Let them know what's going to take place, what the risks are, what the expectations and timeline is, and then monitor that and keep reporting on that as you go through the transition stage of your implementation. Evaluation. This process is the least understood by IT people, but critical to ensuring that a new service or change to a service actually meets business goals. This is a very important area, seldom considered by IT. And it's interesting that in the ITIL v3 that this became a process under service transition. Let's give you an example of what ITIL meant when they put this in place. Let's say you're putting a brand new inventory management service into place, new applications of some kind. You work for a large retail company, and this is a solution that people wanted to go forward with. Your original goal when that solution was strategized was to reduce costs for managing inventory by 10% and reduce inventory turns, in other words, how long products sit on the shelf until they're replaced, by 5 days. So the business came up with those as key goals for putting this particular new solution into place. Through the ITIL evaluation process, what you're going to do is, as a solution is transitioned into a production state, you're going to do the appropriate kinds of testing and monitoring and looking at how well that's operating as a solution and tying that back to, will this truly reduce costs by 10%? Will this truly reduce inventory turns by 5 days? So you're mapping your outcomes of your solution back to the original business outcomes that you intended when you started this in the first place. A lot of times IT doesn't do this. They get excited, they implement a new solution, the solution's tested, it's put into production, and then it's operated. And almost many times nobody goes back and say, did we really get the savings we wanted? Did we really get the benefits we anticipated when we first bought off on implementing the solution to start with? And that is what the evaluation process is about. So IT tends to forget to validate whether the intended financial outcomes or other outcomes are achieved with new and changed services. Again, this is a concept that you may have to do a little communicating and training around as you implement this if you're working with this process. Note that the business needs to be involved at adequate levels to identify and help validate the intended outcomes for any new or changed service. So business people have a very relevant role in this process as it goes forward. And as you can tell, this process heavily interfaces with the service testing process by providing criteria and validation for testing activities. Ultimately, if your outcomes are reduced costs and reduced inventory turns, like in our example, you're going to need to make sure that testing criteria and use cases and testing activities are in place to make sure those things can be tested for and predicted. Also note that this process interfaces with change management to help validate whether changes should go forward or not. In other words, if testing bears out that the outcomes as desired cannot be met, then we need to figure out whether we're truly going to put this solution in production or call a halt to it. Very tough call to make, but one that may be necessary. So again, these are just some considerations with the evaluation process, and hopefully this helped make some of that a little bit clear. Lesson 3, Service Design Processes. In this lifecycle stage, we'll be looking at the V3 Service Design Lifecycle Processes: Service Level Management, Availability Management, Capacity Management, Supplier Management, Service Catalog Management, IT Service Continuity, and Information Security Management. So let's look at service level management. Of all the idle processes, this one has the largest impact on the IT organization, its strategy, and how IT operates, so don't underestimate the effort and the scope of putting this in place. One huge mistake a lot of IT organizations make is thinking that this is just simply about assigning service targets to services or other applications or other things that IT provides. Don't go down that path. You need to understand your services. You need to then set targets for those services in business terms, not IT terms. You need to think about assigning business liaisons from an organizational perspective to work with various user departments and review the results of services as they're delivered. You need to have overall responsibility for service assignments, so this means assigning service owners. You need to understand your services. That may be a first challenge as well in putting this together. That implies you have service definitions, outcomes, agreement on service targets. All those kinds of things need to be in place. Very wide-reaching in terms of the effort that you'll be putting into place with this. Don't provide services and targets that can't be met. So don't be going out there putting service level agreements into place when it's clear that IT can't deliver on those. Another thing to consider is avoid setting service targets like we will provide 99.8% availability uptime for an application or server or whatever that is. That is absolutely meaningless for both IT as well as the business. Now operationally, IT may need to look at utilization and if it gets above or below a certain point and take some actions, and that's certainly okay. But since this is really an outer-facing process to the business, that really provides little meaning. I have yet to be in an IT organization where service levels like these were set and the business was happy with what they were getting. So again, some of the recommendations, which is in the next bullet, you may want to consider. Think of targeting 100% availability for the services you provide, and if more than X outages occur, then a service improvement investigation might be launched or some verbiage like that. You'd be surprised how acceptable that truly is to the business. One of the reasons they prefer that is because that tells them a couple things. It tells them, number one, you're targeting 100%. So you're in line with their needs and their expectations. And number two, if it drops below a certain point, you're proactively going to try to fix it. In other words, you're not sitting there waiting for them to complain before you do something. I can't tell you how many IT organizations I get into that use the 99.8% availability as an example, and the business is very upset with the level of service they're getting, and the IT organization is communicating back, well, but we met our service level, we delivered the 99.8 as we said we would. That just infuriates the business, and it provides no value. So I would recommend not doing that as you put this together. Don't get into service penalties unless somebody absolutely insists. For some reason, I see some IT organizations that are starting down this path, and they put service level agreements into place, and they're scratching their heads over what will we do about providing penalties if we don't make our services. Don't offer up penalties unless the business or your customers truly want some restitution if those things happen. Again, make sure that roles, responsibilities, and activities for service liaisons to the business are clearly defined. Make sure that the service liaisons have enough teeth organizationally in their role and in their job so that if there's some real issues going on with the business units that they're representing, that IT will pay attention and hopefully proactively try to figure out how to best deal with that. As you get started in the service level management process and you're putting service level agreements into place, I would recommend that you start out by implementing whatever service targets are there, and I use the term under observation, for the first 6 months before you solidify and ask for sign-offs. If you start by producing a service level agreement and then immediately ask for a sign-off from the business unit on it, people tend to get a little skittish about signing something when they're not truly sure what they're getting. Rather than go through all of that, if you've been doing this under observation for 6 months, then if somebody's a little nervous about finally signing that service level agreement, you can always follow up by saying, it's okay, we've been doing this for 6 months and you haven't seen any issues to this point. So I find that approach tends to work and ease this into place a lot faster. Lastly, and any of the idle books say this ad infinitum, but don't set your service level agreement targets in other areas until you have operational level agreements and your contract agreements in place for all the people and parties that will be providing services. Service catalog management. Again, the biggest challenge here will be that IT typically has problems and challenges in articulating what services they actually deliver. The Servicing Idle book that we included with your materials is one good source for getting a whole list of what the common core IT services are, along with descriptions and features for them. That can be a good starting point if you're not sure where to start with this. But again, the challenge here is articulating what are the services, what is a service, what are the services that the business will get, how are those services going to be packaged in a manner that is attractive to the business and that they truly understand what they're getting. If you go through this exercise and you have more than 90 to maybe 120, 130 services, you may be over-architecting your solution here. Most large organizations truly do not deliver as many IT services as IT thinks they deliver. A lot of times what's happening there is that IT is again confusing requests. Remember, requests are transactions against a service, and calling each one of those a service. Or they might be confusing each application and calling each application a service. Or they're confusing how the service is delivered. I use the term service channels here, and calling each one a separate service. So if I'm delivering email on workstation is one service, email on laptop is a different service, email on your PDA device is another service. The reality is that's one service called email. It's just, it features a delivery mechanism that goes across those 3 different channels. You may have some challenges in getting IT to buy into the need for a catalog, and you need to plan on that in advance. I think this is an issue that seems to be easing as time goes on. More people are understanding the need for a catalog, but it's still not quite there yet. So plan on the fact that you may get some resistance, or you may not get resistance, but people may treat the catalog as this is just documenting what IT already does and really not pay much attention or treat it very seriously. So make sure you have truly communicated what the need is for a catalog and how it's going to be used and how it's going to drive what IT does and how they deliver their services to the rest of the organization. A quick principle, if you will, remember design principles from our previous learning module, but one key design principle here might be simply, IT will never deliver a service that isn't already in the catalog, or if somebody asks for it, it goes through an escalation process to figure out how they best want to deal with that. So those are ways you can start to instill some seriousness in behavior as you start to put this together. Again, with this process, there's a tendency to jump into the tool sets right away. Okay, again, the tool cannot replace the work of identifying the services that you need to deliver, and realize that in the marketplace today, there's a lot of confusion where these tools are actually request fulfillment workflow types of products. They're not really a service catalog. A basic service catalog can simply be put on a piece of paper with a simple Microsoft Office tool or some other simple tool, and that will provide the needs for having a service catalog very cleanly. A lot of times vendors, to provide value, are throwing in these other mechanisms like allowing you to create service portals or allowing you to create fulfillment workflows and other types of things in order to provide more value with their tool. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but keep in mind that that's not necessarily the essence of what service catalog management is about. Availability management. Remember that availability management is really proactively looking at your infrastructure and the services you deliver, looking at the risks that exist with those, and looking for ways to mitigate those risks. Availability management is really almost more like a solution architect type of activity, proactively looking for what kinds of design elements or changes to the infrastructure need to be made to reduce the likelihoods of risks of failures and other things that might be occurring. Note that this differs from problem management, whereas problems focusing on root cause, it's looking at something that's already taken place, the failure's already occurred. Availability management differs from this in that it's trying to look ahead and see what failures could occur based on the way things have been designed, understand the risks, and then introduce changes to designs and other things in the infrastructure to mitigate those risks. So set the scope and activities for this process very carefully. Again, I find this is one of the most misunderstood of all IT processes. What's interesting about availability management is that for some reason, this is really the most key process to what many business executives are looking for. And for some reason, IT tends to avoid this. It's an interesting disconnect. I think IT is more comfortable reacting to things rather than becoming proactive, or maybe they just don't understand how to do a risk analysis on the infrastructure or on services or something there. But at the end of the day, many times executives are looking to do things like reduce risk within their IT infrastructure, and IT sitting there going off using other processes instead of this one to try to deal with that when it's not really as proactive as what you'll get out of this process. Recognize that this process looks at its activities across all hardware, software, development, training, organization, reporting, all the other infrastructure silos and roles that are out there. Communications are key in this area, and this will take some effort. But availability looks at all things within scope, not just the hardware and software, and that's the key thing to remember. The role of availability management from an organization aspect, how incidents or problems get escalated to it, when availability management needs to step in, when availability management should conduct risk assessments, who they report those to, all of that needs to be very well defined. This is very much a strategic kind of set of activities as well, and needs to be considered as you put that solution in place. Again, those working with this process need to recognize that the solutions, people, skills, process, and not just look at hardware and software as we stated before. You may want to look at some risk management approaches. CRAM is shown here as an example, CRAMM. There's other ones that are out there as well. But you can use these to assess your service risk. Certainly do this exercise for all critical services, and risk assessments really should be part of your overall availability plan. Your availability plan will be driven off your risk assessments to basically say these are the projects and activities we plan to undertake, and here's the outcomes of these in terms of the levels of risk that will be mitigated by doing these. And then lastly, your availability management solution should coordinate with the program office to manage and maintain availability improvement projects that are under its guidance. So typically there will be more than one project that relates to activities that availability is working on, and you may want to consider linkage to a project management or program office type of function to make sure these are being executed correctly. Capacity management. IT is generally comfortable with the need for capacity. They kind of understand that they need to have enough of a resource to provide the appropriate availability and performance. Unfortunately, in most IT organizations, this gets construed as reactively looking at assets, their utilization, and response times. Developing the capability to align the business activity that drives capacity with its services, then project and forecast their impact on your service assets, is really the major hurdle that you're going to have when implementing this process. IT is very comfortable with looking at their resources from a resource capacity planning standpoint. They are uncomfortable with looking at things from a business and or service capacity standpoint. One key challenge is that when you go out to the business and you try to understand the business events that are out there and the volumes of those business events, you may find that the business is just as poor at forecasting those as IT is with technology. For example, you may determine that order volumes are what drives a particular use of an application or service. So you go out to the business and you ask for what is the projected order volume over the next 9 to 12 months. And the business may give you some numbers, but it turns out that they're way off from what actually happens. So getting those communications in place and getting the business to be accurate in their forecast is going to be kind of a challenge as you go forward with this. The goal of capacity management is to be able to take those business forecasts, and again we're slipping into demand management, which we'll look at later, but look at those business forecasts, translate those in terms of to IT types of resources through some kind of sizing and categorization, and then how those resources get used. That requires a modeling effort that does that translation so that as you, in this example, raise the number of orders in the company, you can quickly see what the impact is to your IT infrastructure. It is that upper aspects of capacity planning that will be the biggest challenge that IT will struggle with. So most staff are comfortable with, again, with resource capacity planning, and again, will be very uncomfortable with business and service capacity planning. The effort of developing business forecasts and translating their impacts will be new to most IT staff. How do I take a customer order and translate that to how resources are being used? That's not a simple exercise. Holding the business responsible for the forecast they provide will be a major cultural shift for most organizations. IT is going to have to say that this is the demand forecast indicator that we need to get from the business, report on the volumes, and compare what the business told you with what actually occurred. You need to hold the business's feet to the fire that the business events they're telling you about are actually there or taking place. Some people may be concerned that the business will start to question, why is IT asking for these kinds of things? I have a simple paradigm you may want to consider when getting into those kinds of discussions. Basically, if you're talking to somebody in the business that wants to know why do you need to know all this stuff, just simply put it like, we're going to be putting on a dinner and I need to know how many guests are going to be there to serve correctly. I think they'll understand it from that standpoint. So that's kind of a little trick you can use if you feel there's some resistance from the business in terms of providing some of this information. There needs to be a clear line of communications between this process, business plans and events, that have an impact on capacity. So as the business is making changes, then those need to be reflected in the capacity plan as it goes forward. One challenge you will have, and I've seen this in some companies, is there may be key, very large business events that upper management just doesn't want to communicate at that point in time. I've been in a situation where we did a full-blown capacity plan, included all the right things from a business perspective, and then a sudden merger was announced. This happened to be at a bank, and there was a sudden merger announced that nobody knew about, and it threw the entire capacity plan out of whack at that point. I'm not fully sure how you get over that, but at least you need to be reporting back to the business what they're telling you. So at least if issues start to arise, it doesn't become so much an IT issue as it is a communication issue. Lastly, a word about performance tuning. Performance tuning per idle is part of your capacity planning process. Performance tuning, however, is a different activity than capacity planning. Performance tuning is making custom tweaks, fixes, modifications to service assets in order to get them to perform better or to create more capacity for those assets. So it's a different activity, whereas capacity planning is modeling the future capacity needs based on business events and forecasting IT usage based on those events. If you have performance issues, tuning issues, response time issues, make sure you're addressing those performance issues first before you start projecting future capacity needs. If you have something that's poorly architected and as a result of that poor architecture, it's creating a number of performance problems, simply projecting that out based on volumes is going to yield results that will be acceptable to no one. Make sure you do any critical tuning first and then do the modeling and projection after those have been made. IT service continuity management. Surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, this has been shown to be one of the more easier processes to implement. IT is familiar with what they call disaster recovery. That's been around for decades. There's regulatory requirements that typically are out there that require this process to be in place. So from an IT perspective, understanding the need for IT service continuity is really not going to be a hard thing to get across. However, here's some considerations you may want to think about as you work with this from an idle perspective. The IT staff will generally be more comfortable with inventorying IT components and recovering these based on installed technologies versus identifying what business functions those assets support and making sure that a service is fully recoverable. Let me give you a classic example where this has happened with a very large financial company. They went off and did a major IT service continuity plan, actually built a second data center solely to operate this plan. And their IT department went and did exactly this. They figured what assets would go into that new data center, and they set up the whole plan to put those assets in the data center, to back up data into that data center. There was no consideration for the services that those assets were supporting. If they had taken into account what those services were, they would have understood that this particular company deals with many, many field agent offices. Each of those field agent offices has a very sophisticated LAN infrastructure that allows them to get at the services that they need. When they put up this second data center, considerations for that LAN infrastructure were totally missed, not taken. So in other words, the solution that they just implemented would allow all those service assets to certainly come live when they expected to, but nobody could ever get to them to use the services. So in other words, the whole plan was for naught. Very expensive mistake. Millions and millions of dollars were involved, and there were many IT heads that were gone when that got discovered. So be careful that you fully identify what are your true vital business functions, what are the services that support them, and then through configuration management, make sure you understand what assets are involved in delivering those services, so that when you put your recovery plans in place, you can truly restore a service, not just the assets that are part of it. Clear delineation between availability management and this process, activities and responsibilities needs to be defined. So does this process only cover severe events that pose long-term threats to the business, for example? Okay, what areas will IT service continuity get involved with versus not? When does IT service continuity get escalated to? If I have a major incident that occurs, at what point do I pull the trigger on the service continuity plan? All those kinds of things need to be very clearly delineated, documented, and put in the form of a policy. Roles and responsibilities for supporting this process will cover a very wide swath of your IT organization. The communications and training aspects for continuity readiness shouldn't be underestimated. Everybody in your IT organization will need to become service continuity savvy and smart, so that in the event that this plan has to get invoked, everybody has a clear path and pictures to what they need to do. Planning and readying for that is no small task. Finding time and resource commitment to undertake readiness preparation, training, and continuity testing will also be a major challenge. Most of this needs to be scheduled at the front. You'll typically have a very busy IT department, and the prospect of coming in on a weekend to do recovery testing or whatever is going to meet with some resistance, and how you do this and finding time for that will be a challenge, and you need to plan for that up at the front. And then lastly, you may just flat out have some businesses that have poor missing continuity plans, or they have very poor business recovery plans. Ideally, it's the business that does a business recovery plan and also business impact analysis. IT then takes that information and translates that to what IT services and vital business functions need to be supported, and putting their plans into place. What happens if the business hasn't done a recovery plan, or they've done a poor job at business impact analysis? So again, you're going to need to have a plan and a strategy for how to best deal with that. You may actually have to back up doing your process until some of those things are put into place. Information security management. There's really reluctance by IT to take a holistic view of security when you consider all the aspects of the infrastructure design. And by this I mean having a very large picture of all the things that need to be in place from a security perspective. Audits, policies and controls, virus and intrusion detection, virus management, patch management, federated security, all these kinds of things need to be considered. The Architecting ITIL book presents a special sub-architecture, if you will, for security, and this was done for a reason. It was meant to put out there an entire security infrastructure picture, if you will, of all the things that need to be in place to have a robust set of security facilities. So taking this holistic view will be a challenge. The industry is very much segmented and single-pointed by various areas in security. I've had the situation where vendors will come in with products and say they have everything you need, and it turns out when I usually show them my architecture picture, it turns out that maybe they only cover half of the things that are in there. So you really need to think holistically about your security and consider all the things around security that need to be in place. As you pull this together, development of an IT security policy will need to be done first, followed by classification of your IT assets, meaning what's sensitive, what's not sensitive, who can access what types of items, that kind of thing. If there's not a business security policy in place, that would be the first place to go, by the way, to develop this. Then you may have additional challenges in that the policies and the types of IT assets that are out there may not be very well known. As you get started down this path, by the way, this is one ITIL process where ITIL purposely avoided a lot of detail around how you put this into place, considering that there's other standards out there such as the ISO 27001 and other ones that are there around security. I would strongly suggest that you bring those resources into this effort if you're building it, as those will have the details around what are the things that go into a security policy, tips and techniques around the kinds of things that should be in place, the kinds of controls, etc. So certainly bring those in as part of this when you build this. The security information management needs to be operated and built like any other IT service or things get missed. So again, as you put this into place, think of your security solution as a service or a line of services that you are providing to the business, and then what items would belong with those. That ensures that you're looking, again, holistically at the security issues and solutions that you're putting into place. Don't forget physical security. Features such as designing visitor passes, badges, access to the data center. These tend to be viewed by IT security people as out of scope, that these really belong to the facilities manager, operations manager. I would seriously consider including these in the scope, again, looking holistically at all the security needs of what you're trying to put into place. Again, this is an area that IT will tend to immediately jump to tools first without looking at the whole security picture and what needs to be put into place. Again, do the architecture up at the front. What needs to be in place first? Then as you go shopping for tools, fit those tools and map those tools into your solution architecture where they best fit. Again, think holistically as you go forward with this. Supplier management. It's typical for IT to establish vendor contracts out of the procurement organization with few or very vague service targets. I see this all the time. These need to be set at contract time and should be measurable and quantifiable. Here's another good reason why IT needs to understand the services they deliver first, and then if they're going out for a third-party supplier, what aspects of that service, what pieces and parts of that service is that supplier actually providing, with measurements around what they're actually delivering. Again, think underpinning contracts if you remember service level management. But you need to put targets into this before the contract gets signed, not afterwards. I see far too many vendor contracts where IT or the business is very dissatisfied with what they're getting, and then you look at the contract and realize there's really no meaningful metrics in there or ways to measure the vendor. So think of that up at the front. Try to avoid over-reliance on the supplier to provide and report on their own performance. I see this in many cases where it's the provider that's providing the service reports, not IT, and nobody really knows how they come up with the numbers that they come up with. So be careful with this one, and make sure that you're not relying on them, or at least relying on them to a very great extent for the information that they're providing. As you work with your suppliers, the best way is to aim for a win-win relationship. If you try to do I call it the win-lose relationship. These are IT organizations that like to beat up on suppliers, try to bring them in at the lowest cost, get the most out of them. If you do this, a lot of times the quality of what you get typically is very poor. If there's a win-win relationship established, that vendor wants your business, they're going to do things, they're going to go over and above beyond the what's in the contract to keep getting your business, and will certainly be incented to keep providing good service. So win-win whenever possible, in my opinion, is the way to go, and try to avoid those types of things where it's a win-lose, and even worse, the lose-win. That's where the vendor has you over a barrel, and they're going to stay in there no matter what. So those are the things you're trying to avoid. Make sure you encourage and reward your suppliers for proactively identifying service improvements where they see fit. Ask your supplier, what can we do better? What do you guys see from your perspective that will help us deliver better service or make your delivery much better in terms of quality? So don't be afraid to bring the suppliers into those questions and include them in your continual service improvement efforts as you go forward. Make sure as you put this into place that you establish a supplier manager role to act as a single point of contact, as a liaison to that supplier, and that'll avoid some of the miscommunications. So the supplier manager basically is the go-to person for that supplier. It's also the go-to person from your IT organization if you need to deal with the supplier in any way or fashion. Make sure that you design and build into your solution here clear channels and paths of communication for addressing supplier issues. If there are service complaints, billing issues, other things that are there like that, make sure that there's very clear communications as to how you're going to handle those kinds of issues, and that there's communications paths that are in place. Also make it clear to the suppliers that you use that they are responsible for any subcontractors they use in their performance. I've seen a few situations where a supplier is just delivering very bad performance, and IT is trying to work with that supplier, and the supplier is pointing fingers back to a subcontractor that you're using, saying, well, they screwed up or they just didn't deliver. At the end of the day, make sure that it's clear that your supplier is on the hook for the end performance, no matter whether they use subcontractors or not. Lesson 4, Service Strategy Processes. In this lifecycle stage, we'll be looking at the V3 Service Strategy Lifecycle Processes: IT Financial Management, Demand Management, and Service Portfolio Management. IT financial management. Financial management for IT is a process that executive leadership likes the most, yet for some reason IT likes the least. When you look at most IT organizations, very few of them seem to be interested in developing this process beyond basic budgeting and accounting, or maybe a chargeback or billing if they're doing that. Yet it's the lack of cost transparency within IT that's the most frustrating thing to the business, and I will tell you it is the root cause for business decisions to move to outsourcing more than anything else. I have an old joke here that nobody really outsources for quality, and I still think that's somewhat true in many cases. But why will the business still outsource? And the reason is that for the first time, what they're hearing from the outsourcer is somebody has valued and put a value in a dollar amount on what their IT assets are worth and what their services are worth to them. And that is very comforting from a business perception, because from the business standpoint, it is cost and finance that is the language of business. If it's not providing value, then they need to get rid of it or change it. And if it is providing value, they will continue to invest in it. So it behooves people that are looking at this process to recognize how important this really is in providing, and with a goal of providing transparency for what IT is spending on the various services and areas that they're working with. Another thing to recognize that drives this is that most IT budgets in today's industry, more than 60 to 80% of their IT budget in many cases is spent on non-discretionary spend, meaning those are dollars that the business cannot take away because they're needed to just keep IT running on a day-to-day basis. A smaller and smaller amount of that money is available for new projects, putting in value-add services and those things. And again, this is an area that the business finds very frustrating. They don't understand why that non-discretionary spend keeps going up year after year, or what they're getting for that non-discretionary spend. So this financial management process can provide a tremendous amount of value by starting to create some of that transparency. IT in general, again, is very uncomfortable with this in terms of financial reporting controls, and again, my experience has been they view this process as the responsibility of someone else. So this will be a challenge in that you may not find many stakeholders within the IT organization that buy into your IT financial management processes. In fact, what you'll find is a lot of times the financial end is going to be driven by people outside of IT. IT historically has little experience and expertise in communicating financial status to business executives, and they may need some additional help and templates for how this is done. How do I actually put a return on investment picture together for management in a way that they quickly understand a new project or a new service that we're proposing to put into place? How do I communicate the transparency in terms of what IT is spending their money on? What does that look like? Those are things that IT typically doesn't have skills with, and you may need to consider when we talk about assessing for skills gaps. This might be a good example of one area where you might need some additional help. An IT cost model can provide tremendous benefit by saving time and producing reports and answers to financial questions. This should be tightly linked to your configuration management CMDB. So what we're saying here is that a little unknown fact is that most IT financial departments literally spend 80 to 90% of their time simply researching and gathering information about assets and their costs. If you've already tied these into your configuration management database, in other words, for each CI type or CI that you have, you can also associate it with cost. You can quickly automate ways of producing reports and information that make it very quick to do what-if types of analysis and pull reports together and reduce a lot of the labor that's involved with the research that's behind some of this. Something to consider. If you're able to help CIOs understand what services they deliver and the cost behind those services, that is a piece of information that is highly valued at executive levels. And I'd urge you to think about trying to put a solution in place that gets them to that point. Another interesting part of this is for IT chargeback. You may have experience with billing customers for usage of MIPS and paper and network bandwidth and lines and CPU cycles or anything else. And you may also have a similar experience with having charged the users on those factors, that they get very upset with what they're being charged for and don't understand why they're being charged so much money. If you take a look at the business demand, if you remember those demand factors that we talked about briefly in the capacity management piece of this learning module, if you start charging your business by those demand factors, in other words, if a demand factor is a business event like a customer order or a report or maybe number of employees you have in your company, and simply start pulling together the picture of the IT costs behind those. So I'm now charging them, you're going to pay, for example, X IT dollars for every order you have to have processed, or every employee that you have in your department. The business understands those things in a heartbeat, and it again helps to create that transparency. So for IT chargeback, you may want to consider putting something like that in place. The big challenge you will have with chargeback, and almost the biggest political part of that effort, is what charging algorithms will you use, and will they be acceptable to all the stakeholders that will be billed for services? The challenge you have is a political one, in that a lot of times people are angling to pay less money, and so we'll want to see a charging algorithm that works in their favor versus against them. So those are the types of issues you're going to run into if you're implementing chargeback and billing. The biggest cultural challenge with this particular process and getting this in place is really getting IT to become more accountable for the spend they have and the impacts of that spend with each strategy that they're putting into place. And then lastly, an ongoing process life cycle for looking at cost opportunities really should be part of the solution. You can argue that belongs with the continual service improvement, and I wouldn't argue too heavily against that. But this is a key process that can kind of drive an improvement picture from a cost perspective. And again, this is what will really have the greatest impact on changing perceptions in the business about what IT is doing. Demand management. Again, demand management is really understanding what are the business events that consume and drive the use of your IT services. So in order to do demand management, you better really understand what your services are in the first place, or you're really going to have a lot of challenges with this particular process. So in my mind, understanding what your services are, probably doing a service portfolio effort, needs to be done ahead of this in order to really do a good job with this particular process. For each service you have that you've identified, you're going to identify one or more demand factors that drive its use. And again, these should be very much in business terms. Number of employees, number of sales, revenue dollars, number of customers, other things that make sense for whatever business or industry you happen to be in. The business, again, will be initially surprised by asking IT for forecasts of these indicators. So if I've decided that it's number of employees or headcount that drives a particular service, then I need the business to tell me what is the actual forecast for headcount over some future period of time. And again, if faced with resistance in that area from the business, why are you asking me for things like this? Again, put this in terms of I'm serving a dinner, and I need to know how many guests are going to be there in order to serve it appropriately. I think they'll understand that. Capacity management goes without saying. They're going to be heavily involved with this process to convert the business factors to IT resource demands. So while this process is mostly focused around the business elements and the volumes of those elements that demand and drive services, it's going to be capacity management that does the legwork of translating these demand elements into actual IT resource usage. Reporting on demand factors and business volumes is going to be very key to this. As the business gives you volumes, again, let's use our number of employees example. If you go to the business and they tell you a forecast for headcount, you need to make sure that you record that and track that, and then keep going back to the business to say, here's what you predicted 6 months ago. Are we still on the same path today, or has that changed? You need to keep that in mind as you keep working with the business, because again, having accurate business forecasts will make sure you have fairly accurate capacity forecasts that underlie that. And then lastly, financial management may need to get involved in charging or changing charging policies for services if resources become scarce. So this is the aspect of this process that attempts to try to control demand And again, if you decide that the way to control demand is to charge more for it to reduce the demand, or maybe the opposite, reduce the cost for it to increase demand, then again, you're going to need to get the financial management process involved to work with that. Service portfolio management. Your service portfolio represents the IT strategy across the board. An understanding of what the services are being delivered today by IT and their costs are really critical to making this process work, and actually to make this process provide some tremendous value. Most CIOs cannot articulate what services they provide and what their service costs are, and what the unit costs, as driven by demand, are that consumes those services. Without this information, the CIO is literally just managing bundles of technology, bundles of assets, and they really have a communication challenge with the rest of the business. So part of the service portfolio management process and the key outcome is to try to put that information, services, service costs, and demand costs or unit costs, in the hands of the CIO. And with that, the paths to create IT strategies will become fairly clear. In situations where we've been able to do this, the excitement and the acceptance of ITIL and IT service management rises considerably. This is something that CIOs just love to see. I have a quote from one CIO, which was, "I've died and gone to heaven," when they saw some of the information that was coming out of this. So the service portfolio is very key to deciding what are the overall services and what are your strategies around those services. The challenge you will have is at the executive level, there's some education that needs to happen with them. The ITIL concept is that the service portfolio really represents a portfolio of IT services that are being invested in. So they're actually service investments. So it's almost like an investment portfolio for your stocks, except you're investing in services. And the decisions around what services to invest in or de-invest, or maybe decommission services or add new services, is totally driven by what the CIO and the business sees as value. However, they need a tool like the portfolio in order to help drive that IT strategy to create that value. So this will be a challenge, because right now the average CIO unfortunately gets misled by others in the industry that tout your IT strategy is somehow equal to your application portfolio or your financial portfolio or other items, or your asset portfolio. And they're used to seeing things like that, and there's some education you're going to have to do to say that at the end of the day, those things don't really matter. It's your service portfolio is really where the business is going to see the value. Projects, by the way, projects represent investments in enhancements or creation of new services. That's the purpose of a project. So simply having a portfolio of projects doesn't really provide necessarily a true IT strategy. Worse yet, remember we said that 60 to 80% of the IT budget's on non-discretionary spend? Well, a project portfolio is only focusing on that narrow slice, that 20%, if you will, of projects that doesn't really represent all of what IT is doing. So again, this is the kind of education you're going to need to have at the executive level to help them understand how this works and what this is really about. ITIL guidance, again, is in identifying markets, who your customers are, how to identify value. Very well documented in the service strategy book. And I know that book seems confusing to many IT people. It is very much so, and well worth reading it very slowly, page by page, to understand some of the concepts that are presented there around how you really do IT strategy. How do you determine what your services really are? How do you segment those services by the various customers and business units and departments that you have to service with your IT services? A lot of good stuff in there. However, it is certainly not an easy read. But if this is an area where you're working in, I would strongly suggest you use that as a base as you go forward. The exercise of developing a service portfolio may underscore many IT operational and organizational issues. Again, these need to be reviewed with executive management when these come up to determine how far the current appetite is to address these at this point in time. So as you're putting services into your portfolio, You really need to work with all the stakeholders involved that get any kind or any form of an IT service and decide how it's going to be described within that portfolio and what items and information you really want to track within that portfolio as well. Again, at a very basic, I would recommend if you're just getting started with this, make the portfolio simple. And what I would simply do is identify your services, your high-level descriptions and features for those services. And again, things like that can be stolen from the Servicing ITIL book if you want to get a jump start with it. Identify the costs for each service. That's, in other words, you can articulate what you're spending for email delivery, what you're spending for inventory management, those kinds of things. And then the demand in terms of what business factors consume those services and what is the cost per that business factor. So with that information, you will provide a tremendous amount of value to an executive. I guarantee they will be very excited with that information. And for that reason, I think this particular process, the service portfolio management one, very key in terms of how you're operating and running IT from a strategic level. Slide 30. Lesson 5, Continual Service Improvement Process. We'll take a look at this last life cycle stage by looking at the one process that exists in this one, the 7-step improvement process. As we look at this 7-step improvement process, here's a number of things to consider as you put this in place. Remember that the 7-step improvement process is really the ongoing process by which you will be continually looking at your various IT services, the quality of the delivery of those services, and then identifying discrete improvement efforts that can be made to make those services better and better over time. If you look at our ITIL implementation approach, again, the continual service improvement process will drive when you go back and start that entire implementation life cycle again. So looking at the particular 7-step improvement process, a couple things that you may run into as you start to implement this. Number one is IT typically doesn't like to measure anything and will approach measurements as a task to please upper management versus focusing on what is needed to provide quality service. I know this sounds a bit harsh, but in probably 9 out of 10 IT organizations that I've seen, that's typically what's going on. The only reason that performance reports are being produced and metrics are being produced is because somebody in management, either outside of IT or maybe it was at the upper levels of IT, demanded that those things get done. So again, you're going to have a bit of a cultural issue in just getting off the ground with these. Secondly, IT is generally good at measuring technologies, but they're not so good at measuring processes and services. So the technologies, I think you will find many IT people don't have too much of a problem with measuring how resources are being used and performance and those kinds of things. However, measuring things like processes will be a challenge. To mitigate that, you can look again at the Measuring ITIL book with your materials, as that will provide a good starter set of KPIs for processes. And that's a good thing maybe to start with, and feel free to tailor that to the needs that you have. Services will require that there's already service level agreements and service targets in place that can be measured and reported on so that you can look at that. So again, the processes and services will be a challenge. The technology is not quite so much. IT's pretty good at those. The other challenge you'll have is that the IT organization will need to culturally understand that improvement is an ongoing program. It's not a one-time project. So this is a process that we'll execute every several months, if you will, and how you do that's up to you. But it's ongoing, and that it's not that we just instituted this process because there were some issues or problems, but the fact that we're proactively going to be looking at how things are being delivered and improving them, making them better and better over time. As you start the 7-step improvement process, watch out for this trap. Many people in IT typically start at step 2 of that process, not step 1. Step 2 of that process, if you look at the chart of questions that's included in the ITIL books, will say what can be measured instead of step 1, which says what should be measured. In other words, what IT is doing is saying, well, gee, we need to take some measurements So let's look at our tool set and let's see what metrics come out of those tools, and that's what we're going to put in terms of metrics. What you really should be doing is starting with what should be measured. What do we need to monitor and measure and track to make sure that we're delivering high quality IT services? Then we go to step 2 and figure out, based on our present tool set, what can we actually deliver out of the needed metrics. We might be able to deliver all of them, or we might not be able to deliver all of them. We need to understand that difference between what we should be delivering and what we absolutely can deliver. If you find that there's a gap and you don't have the right tool sets, or you can't, for whatever reason, get accurate measurements with the tool sets that you have, keep in mind that that is not an excuse to not measure something. And I've been in some departments where people will say, well, we're not going to take any measurements of this particular area or metric because we have no means of accurately collecting that. There are assumptions and analogous measurements that you can always be made and make in order to kind of just think of them as temporary metrics that you can make in order to still report on those areas. Let me give you an example of this. It's a bit of a gross example, but works just as well. Let's say you absolutely had no incident management tools in your IT organization. However, you've decided that it's important for you to understand how many incidents you get. You may simply decide, since we don't have a tool at this point in time, we're going to track incidents by how many calls come into the IT organization. If we have a service desk, we can track them there, or maybe manually if we don't have a service desk. But somehow we're just going to log every phone call that comes into the IT organization. And we'll assume that the number of calls that come in are equal to the number of incidents that we're getting. Now, you may say right off the bat, well, that's not really that accurate. Some calls might be for information or to say hello or who knows what. They're not all incidents. But what you've done there is you put a stick in the ground and you said that is the best approach that we have at this point in time because we don't have the right kinds of tools to make much better measurements. Management and executive management will understand that in a heartbeat. And it's okay to bring that up in meetings and say, this is not the greatest way to measure this, but this is what I have at my disposal today. This is where our capabilities are at right now. And it'll be up to management to make the decisions whether they truly then want to fund, put money in the budget for better tooling capabilities or something else to get better measurements. But anyway, the bottom line here is you should always be measuring what you should be measuring in any which way you can, and don't let the lack of tools prevent you from doing that. Lastly, there should be a focus on KPIs. These are metrics that allow for management to make key decisions or take an action. IT will struggle with what is the appropriate kinds of metrics that matter versus operational metrics. There's a tendency for IT to put voluminous reports together. The majority of those reports and the information in them tends to be operational. As an example, let's take change management. What's important and what I'm looking for in my measurements for change management are when do I need to take actions or make a decision, and I need the metrics to help me decide that. That becomes a KPI. So if I simply send a report to management that says we did, let's say, 3,000 changes this month, all I'm providing is operational information that has no meaning to management. It's not something I can make a decision with. And worse than that, management will get confused. What does 3,000 changes mean? Is that something good? Is that something bad? Should we be trying to make that number smaller? Is it not enough changes? It really has no meaning for them. Now, a KPI might be taking some additional measurements, like how many changes did I make that month, and how many changes did I actually implement with no defaults or errors. I can divide that number, so the number of changes that went in with no errors divided by all changes that went in, and now I have a change effectiveness ratio or change success ratio that I can now report to management. That now becomes a KPI, and picture how that might be used. If I go to management and say that my change effectiveness ratio is sitting at 95% or 98%, that sounds like a generally good picture. That means 95 to 98% of all changes that I wanted to make went successfully with no problem. If I go in and show management a number that says, let's say it's 42%, meaning only 42% of the changes we make go in successfully, that immediately tells management that they have a change management problem and that some action needs to be taken for them to fix it. So that's a good example of what a KPI can do from a management perspective. And again, it's a focus that it's something that management can make a decision on. So a simple way to think about this is, as you're putting your metrics together, always ask yourself, what will management do with this number that we're providing them? What decisions or actions will they be able to take as a result of the number they're being given? If you find that they can't, that there's really no decision that can be made or number, chances are it's really just an operational measurement, which you may need to take for historical purposes or to look at other areas, but it's not really a KPI that should be reported up the chain. So let's step back now and take a look at where we are at in our implementation efforts. We've now done 6 modules and covered just about all the phases of our ITIL implementation lifecycle except for IT service management transition. That is the area that we will cover in Module 7. Up to this point, we reviewed the overall lifecycle. We helped create a vision for our implementation. We covered assessments, planning your projects, creating initial wins that provide immediate value to your stakeholders, how you would design your solutions, and then also covered some general considerations and issues as we start to put our processes into place that people have seen when doing real live implementation efforts. So now we're ready for Module 7, IT Service Management Transition. When we cover that module, we will walk you through a step-by-step process for building your IT service management organization. We will cover some general ITSM transition concepts, how to transition your services into a production state, what are some schemas and strategies for transitioning those processes into production state, embedding your processes into the organization, and then we'll conclude with a little bit on IT service management and metrics and some concepts around putting service reporting and metrics into place.